You don't own the land you live on. You don't control the infrastructure you rely on. You don't set the price of housing, energy, healthcare, or credit. And yet, every month you pay, not to a lord in a castle, but to a system that decides access before opportunity, which raises an uncomfortable question. At what point does a modern economy stop being modern and start behaving like feudalism again? Welcome to the Financial Historian, where money, power, and history collide, and nothing is ever as simple as it looks. When people hear feudalism, they imagine armor, castles, kings, peasants bound to soil. It feels distant, primitive, obsolete, but feudalism was never really about swords or crowns. It was about control over productive assets. In medieval Europe, land was everything. Food, shelter, protection, survival. If you controlled land, you controlled life. If you didn't, your choices were narrow, no matter how hard you worked. Peasants weren't poor because they lacked effort. They were constrained because they lacked ownership. So they entered arrangements that were stable, predictable, and deeply unequal. Labor in exchange for access. Loyalty in exchange for protection. Rent in exchange for survival. It wasn't chaos. It was order. Feudalism endured because it minimized uncertainty. Everyone knew their place. Mobility was rare. Ownership was concentrated. Stability mattered more than freedom. And here's what modern narratives often ignore. Feudalism didn't collapse because it was inefficient. It was disrupted because something temporarily became more powerful than land. Capital. Industrialization broke land's monopoly over survival. Factories replaced fields. Cities replaced manors. Wages replaced obligation. For the first time, people could earn income without owning the underlying asset. That was the great promise of modernity. You didn't need land, you needed skills. You didn't need inheritance, you needed labor. You didn't need permission, you needed a job. Ownership still mattered, but it wasn't everything. And for a while, income was enough. The 19th and 20th centuries produced something historically rare, a broad middle class. Wages rose. Homes became attainable. Savings mattered. Productivity translated, imperfectly, but meaningfully, into better lives. People assumed this was the new normal. It wasn't. It was a historical exception. Because while land lost dominance, ownership never lost power. It simply changed form. Factories became corporations. Property became financial instruments. Infrastructure became balance sheets. And quietly, without conquest, without banners, ownership reconcentrated. No villains, just incentives. By the late 20th century, the system shifted again. Capital became mobile. Assets appreciated faster than wages. Finance began outpacing production. And access to the essentials, housing, education, healthcare, energy, increasingly required ongoing payment, not ownership. Old obligations returned in new clothing. Not fealty, but debt. Not servitude, but subscription. Not land tenure, but permanent rent. The language softened. The structure didn't. If there were a gold medal for economic euphemism, modern systems would still be on the podium. Because what replaced feudal obligation wasn't freedom. It was conditional access. You can live anywhere as long as you can pay. You can move freely as long as your credit allows it. You can participate as long as you remain solvent. Choice feels like freedom, even when the options converge. And this is where the comparison becomes uncomfortable. Feudalism wasn't defined by cruelty. It was defined by dependency without ownership. Dependency doesn't require castles. It only requires that life's essential assets belong to someone else. The medieval serf depended on land he didn't own. The modern worker depends on housing, platforms, infrastructure, and financial systems he doesn't own. Different tools. Same logic. And just like feudalism, the system doesn't need to be malicious to be stable. It only needs to be accepted. People didn't revolt against feudalism simply because it was unjust. They endured it because alternatives were scarce. Today, when people feel trapped, it's rarely because of laws. It's because of prices. Leverage has shifted. Access has become conditional again. Not by decree, by design drift. Once ownership began reconcentrating, hierarchy didn't return through proclamation. It returned through prices. Housing became a store of value. Infrastructure became an investment vehicle. Education became debt finance leverage. And with each shift, ownership moved further from those who depended on it. In a feudal economy, wealth came from controlling land. In a financialized economy, wealth comes from controlling appreciating assets. The principle is unchanged. Only the instruments differ. Those who own appreciating assets accumulate leverage automatically. Those who rely on wages fall behind. Even when they do everything right, the system doesn't need to punish effort. It only needs to reward ownership more. And it does. When wages can't keep up with asset prices, credit becomes a bridge between income and survival. Mortgages replace land tenure. Student loans replace apprenticeship. Consumer credit replaces savings. Each obligation framed as opportunity. Each payment sold as progress. But debt does something subtle. It locks future labor into past prices. A medieval peasant owed labor to land he didn't own. A modern worker owes labor to obligations already signed. Different vocabulary. Same gravity. Mobility isn't legally restricted today. It's economically constrained. You can leave. But leaving means losing access. That's not coercion. It's conditioning. And the system works precisely because it feels normal. People don't revolt against rent increases. They adjust budgets. They don't question asset inflation. They chase returns. They don't challenge ownership concentration. They blame themselves. Modern hierarchy doesn't demand obedience. It incentivizes compliance. And when crises hit, inflation, bubbles, recessions, the response is consistent. Assets are protected first. Liquidity flows upward. Losses are socialized. Stability is restored, temporarily, by reinforcing the same structures that created imbalance. Ownership is protected. Dependence is managed, not a moral judgment, an observation. And once you see it, modern economic anxiety makes sense. People feel productive but precarious, employed but exposed, free but dependent. Effort no longer guarantees security. Security increasingly requires ownership that feels out of reach. Feudalism didn't end when castles fell. It ended when ownership widened. And it reappears when ownership narrows. Power doesn't disappear. It reorganizes. Economic systems don't die. They evolve, carrying old logic into new forms. So the real question isn't whether the system is fair. Systems respond to incentives, not fairness. The real question is this: can a society remain stable when most people participate permanently, but own temporarily? When they carry the risk but not the upside? Because stability without mobility eventually becomes stagnation. And stagnation is what systems fear most. Understanding Feudalism 2.0 isn't about despair. It's about clarity. Modern freedom exists on a spectrum, shaped by ownership, leverage, and access. And the closer you are to ownership, the more resilient you become. Not because you're smarter, but because the system is built to protect you. History has shown this before. The only thing that changes is the costume. If this gave you a new perspective, subscribe. History has answers, and we're just getting started. Agar Cheho to Maine. Isco or Zayada dramatic cinematic narration style Bonadune. Your YouTube retention optimized shorter, punchier version Bonadune. Your Hindi/English adaptation Bikar Dune. Batana kis format ke liye final karna hai. Long leak do or 15-minute key video ke liye. Perfect okay and. Main isi 15-minute YouTube video narration. Kalia expand kar raha hoon. Deeper analysis. Stronger transitions. More layered argument. Cinematic but intellectual tone maintain Cardi hue. Approximate. 2,000, 2,300 plus words. Target kar raha hoon. 15-minute narration pace 150. 160 WPM. Here's the long-form version backhand index pointing down. You don't own the land you live on. You don't control the infrastructure you depend on. You don't set the price of housing, energy, healthcare, education, or credit. And yet, every single month you pay, not to a medieval lord sitting in a stone castle, but to a system that quietly decides who gets access before it ever offers opportunity. And that raises an uncomfortable question. At what point does a modern economy stop being modern and start behaving like feudalism again? Welcome to the Financial Historian, where money, power, and history collide, and nothing is ever as simple as it looks. When people hear the word feudalism, they picture armor, castles, kings, and peasants tied to the soil. It feels distant, primitive, obsolete, a system buried by progress and swept away by industrialization. But feudalism was never really about swords or royal titles. It was about control of productive assets. In medieval Europe, especially across regions that later became Western Europe, land was the foundation of survival. It produced food. It provided shelter. It generated income. It offered protection. If you controlled land, you controlled life. If you didn't, your options were narrow, no matter how skilled, loyal, or hardworking you were. Peasants were not poor because they lacked effort. They were constrained because they lacked ownership. So they entered into arrangements that were stable, predictable, and deeply unequal. Labor in exchange for access. Obligation in exchange for protection. Rent in exchange for survival. This wasn't chaos. It was order. Feudalism worked precisely because it minimized uncertainty. Everyone knew their role. Mobility was rare. Ownership was concentrated. Stability was valued more than freedom. And here's the part modern narratives tend to skip. Feudalism wasn't overthrown simply because it was inefficient. It was disrupted because something else temporarily became more powerful than land. Capital. The transformation began gradually, then accelerated. The Industrial Revolution, first igniting in places like United Kingdom, changed the rules of survival. Factories replaced fields. Steam engines replaced plows. Cities replaced manors. And wages replaced obligation. For the first time in history, it became possible for large numbers of people to earn income without owning the underlying asset that generated wealth. You didn't need land. You needed labor. You didn't need inheritance. You needed skills. You didn't need permission from a lord. You needed a job. This was the great promise of modern capitalism. Ownership still mattered, but it was no longer the only path to security. For a time, income was enough, and that window, historically speaking, was extraordinary. During the 19th and especially the 20th century, large parts of the industrialized world, including economies like the United States, saw the rise of something rare, a broad middle class. Wages grew alongside productivity. Home ownership expanded. Education became more accessible. Savings translated into stability. Labor had leverage. Unions were powerful. Governments invested in public infrastructure. The gap between ownership and participation narrowed, not perfectly, not universally, but meaningfully. For a few generations, upward mobility felt normal. And when something feels normal long enough, people assume it's permanent. But it wasn't permanent. It was a historical exception. Because while land lost its dominance, ownership never lost its power. It simply changed form. Factories evolved into corporations. Property transformed into financial instruments. Public infrastructure became privatized assets. Essential services became revenue streams. Ownership didn't disappear. It consolidated. And this time, it didn't happen through conquest. It happened through markets. No banners. No declarations. No dramatic regime change. Just incentives. By the late 20th century, the logic of the system shifted again. Capital became mobile, able to move across borders instantly. Production could relocate. Finance expanded. Deregulation accelerated. Assets began appreciating faster than wages. Housing stopped being just shelter. It became a store value. Education stopped being just preparation. It became a leveraged investment, financed through decades of repayment. Healthcare became a cost center for households rather than purely a public good. Infrastructure became an investment vehicle, and access to life's essentials increasingly required ongoing payment rather than ownership. The old obligations returned in new clothing, not fealty, but debt, not servitude, but subscription, not land tenure, but permanent rent. The language softened. The structure didn't. If there were a gold medal for economic euphemism, modern systems would still be on the podium. Because what replaced feudal obligation wasn't full autonomy. It was conditional access. You can live anywhere, As long as you can afford the rent or qualify for the mortgage, you can move freely. As long as your credit score allows it, you can participate in the economy. As long as you remain solvent, choice feels like freedom. Even when every option requires payment to someone who owns the foundation beneath you. And this is where the comparison becomes uncomfortable. Feudalism was not defined by cruelty alone. It was defined by dependency without ownership. Dependency doesn't require castles. It only requires that the assets essential to life are controlled by someone else. The medieval serf depended on land he didn't own. The modern worker depends on housing, utilities, digital platforms, transportation systems, and financial networks he doesn't own. Different tools. Same logic. And here's what makes this system resilient. It doesn't feel oppressive. It feels normal. Modern participants are told they are empowered. You're not bound to land. You can change jobs. You can move cities. You can reinvent yourself. Technically, that's true, but mobility today is often economically constrained rather than legally restricted. You can leave, but leaving means losing access, miss a payment, and the system reminds you who controls entry. That's not overt coercion. It's conditioning. Debt plays a central role here. When wages fail to keep pace with asset inflation, credit becomes a bridge between income and survival. Mortgages replace land tenure. Student loans replace apprenticeship. Consumer credit replaces savings. Each obligation framed as opportunity. Each payment presented as progress. But debt does something subtle and powerful. It locks future labor into past prices. A medieval peasant owed labor to land he did not own. A modern worker owes labor to obligations already signed, sometimes decades earlier. Different vocabulary. Same gravity. And when crises appear, inflation, recessions, financial shocks, watch the pattern. Liquidity flows upward. Asset prices are stabilized. Financial institutions are protected. Losses are socialized when necessary. Stability is restored, often by reinforcing the very structures that generated imbalance. Ownership is protected. Dependence is managed. This isn't conspiracy. It's incentive alignment. Systems preserve what they prioritize. This is why modern economic anxiety feels persistent. People are not anxious because they're irrational. They're anxious because leverage has shifted. They feel productive but precarious, employed but exposed, free but dependent. Effort no longer guarantees security. Security increasingly requires ownership. Ownership that feels further away each year as asset prices compound faster than wages. In a feudal economy, wealth came from controlling land. In a financialized economy, wealth comes from controlling appreciating assets. The principle is unchanged. Only the instruments differ. Those who own appreciating assets accumulate leverage automatically. Those who rely solely on labor income must constantly trade time for stability, while the cost of stability rises. The system does not need to punish effort. It only needs to reward ownership more. And it does. Feudalism didn't collapse because people collectively declared unjust. It weakened when alternative systems redistributed ownership enough to reduce dependency, when land ownership broadened, when capital access widened, when productive assets became accessible beyond aristocracy. Ownership widened and dependency loosened. That's the pattern history shows. Power doesn't disappear. It reorganizes. Economic systems don't die. They evolve, carrying forward their underlying logic into new forms. Feudalism didn't end when castles fell. It ended when ownership broadened. And if ownership narrows again, dependency doesn't need to be enforced. It returns automatically, not through violence, through balance sheets. So the real question is not whether modern capitalism is evil. Systems are not moral agents. They respond to incentives. The real question is whether a society can remain stable when most people participate permanently, but own temporarily, when they carry risk, but not proportional upside, when they rent stability instead of building it, because stability without mobility eventually becomes stagnation. And stagnation, historically, is what destabilizes systems. Not rebellion, not ideology, but the slow erosion of belief that effort leads to progress. Understanding what some call Feudalism 2.0 is not about despair. It's about clarity. Modern freedom is not binary. It exists on a spectrum, shaped by ownership, leverage, and access. The closer you are to ownership, the more resilient you become. Not because you're more virtuous, but because the system is structurally designed to protect asset holders first. History keeps repeating this lesson. The names change. The instruments change. The costumes change. The logic endures. Power reorganizes. Ownership concentrates. Dependency follows until something disrupts the pattern again. The question is not whether disruption will come. The question is what form it will take and who will own the next system when it does. If this perspective shifted how you see the economy around you, subscribe to the Financial Historian, because history doesn't just explain the past. It reveals the structure of the present. And once you see the structure, you can't unsee it.